The Colosseum of Vandros was a monument to brutality, a place where warriors and beasts met their end for the amusement of the bloodthirsty crowd. For centuries, the arena had been a symbol of power and entertainment, its sands soaked with the blood of champions, criminals, and the unfortunate souls chosen as fodder. The crowd cheered for nothing less than spectacle, gore, skill, and victory delivered in equal measure. Tonight was supposed to be no different. The Emperor, ever eager to keep the masses entertained, had decided to introduce a new twist to the games. Instead of another battle-hardened warrior or a monstrous beast from the far reaches of the Empire, they had chosen a human. A regular, untrained human. Someone utterly unequipped to fight. The idea had started as a joke among the nobles, something absurd to amuse them in their endless indulgence. The people would roar with laughter as the poor fool was torn apart within seconds. The betting houses quickly dismissed the match as a formality. There was no chance of survival. Daniel Carter had no idea how he got here. One moment, he was waiting for his morning coffee in a Chicago cafe, scrolling through emails on his phone, and the next, he was waking up on a cold stone floor, the stench of sweat, blood, and damp air overwhelming his senses. His head pounded as he sat up, his fingers brushing against the rough walls of his cell. The dim torchlight flickered against rusted iron bars, and beyond them, he could hear the distant roar of a crowd. "Another one?" a voice grumbled nearby. Daniel turned his head to see a man with a thick scar across his cheek sitting against the wall in the adjacent cell. The man gave him a pitying look. "Where am I?" Daniel asked, his voice cracking. His throat was dry. "The Colosseum of Vandros," the man said. "They do this sometimes. Grab someone from the streets. Or another world. Doesn't matter. You're fresh meat for the arena." Daniel's stomach twisted. This wasn't a dream. The rough stone under his fingers, the distant metallic clang of weapons, the smell, it was all too real. He looked down at himself. He was wearing what looked like a crude tunic, and beside him lay a sword. It wasn't even a particularly good sword. "I don't know how to fight," he said, more to himself than anyone else. The scarred man gave a dry chuckle. "Then it'll be quick." Before he could process what was happening, the guards arrived. Two large, armored men grabbed him by the arms, hauling him to his feet. His legs felt weak as they dragged him down a long corridor. The sound of the crowd grew louder with every step, and soon, he was standing in the blinding light of the arena entrance. The vast stadium was packed with thousands of spectators, their faces painted with anticipation. High above, in an opulent balcony, sat a man draped in gold-trimmed robes, undoubtedly the Emperor. His expression was one of amusement, as if he were watching a particularly entertaining play. In the center of the arena stood his opponent. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. It was a minotaur. A hulking, 7-foot-tall beast with rippling muscles, curved horns, and an axe that looked heavy enough to split him in two with a single swing. The creature's nostrils flared as it locked eyes with him. Daniel's hands shook as he was shoved forward, his boots kicking up dust. The announcer boomed over the crowd, introducing him in a voice dripping with mockery. "And now, the challenger! A stranger from the unknown lands. The unarmed, untrained, and undoubtedly soon to be dead. Daniel Carter!" The laughter was deafening. A horn sounded. The fight had begun. The Minotaur charged. Panic exploded in Daniel's chest. His survival instincts kicked in, and he did the only thing his body could manage. He dove to the side, barely avoiding the axe that slammed into the ground where he had stood moments before. Dust and debris flew into the air. The crowd gasped. Daniel scrambled to his feet, his pulse hammering in his ears. The Minotaur turned, eyes narrowing, seemingly irritated that its prey had moved. It charged again. Daniel ducked, tripping over his own feet in the process. His sword, still in its scabbard, tangled between his legs, sending him sprawling into the dirt. The Minotaur, in its attempt to adjust its attack mid-strike, overcompensated. The momentum sent it stumbling forward. The massive beast stepped directly onto the blood-slicked ground left by a previous fight. Its hooves lost traction. Time seemed to slow as the Minotaur, off balance, tilted dangerously forward. It twisted, trying to regain its footing, but its own weight betrayed it. The axe, still mid-swing, caught in the sand, forcing its body to pivot awkwardly. There was a sickening crunch. The beast's own massive horns impaled its throat as it hit the ground. A stunned silence fell over the arena. Thousands of spectators sat in disbelief, their laughter cut off as if someone had snatched the air from their lungs. The Minotaur twitched once, then went still. The dust settled. Daniel, still lying on the ground, blinked in shock. He had no idea what had just happened. He hadn't even drawn his sword. He looked up at the royal balcony. The Emperor's face was unreadable for a long moment, then suddenly, he burst into laughter. Well, well, he mused, stroking his chin. That was unexpected. The audience, unsure how to react, hesitated before erupting into cheers, laughter, and applause. The absurdity of what they had just witnessed was too much. Daniel had won. And he hadn't even done anything. The arena remained eerily silent for a few moments longer, as if the entire city of Vandros was collectively trying to process what had just happened. Then, the cheers erupted, louder than any before. It wasn't a celebration of skill, nor was it admiration for the so-called warrior standing in the dust-covered pit. It was pure, unfiltered amusement. A man with no training, no experience, and no chance had somehow won, and the absurdity of it was simply too entertaining to ignore. The Emperor leaned back in his golden throne, a wide grin spreading across his face. Well, he mused, sipping his wine, this is something new. He turned to his advisors, who were furiously whispering among themselves. Declare him the champion. One of the officials hesitated before clearing his throat. Your Grace, you mean, for this match, correct? A temporary title? No, the Emperor said, standing. Let's make it official. Until he loses, he remains the champion of the arena. The announcement sent another wave of laughter through the crowd. The betting houses groaned. This was not how tonight was supposed to go. No one had placed wagers on the human. The match had been designed as a novelty, a joke at best, yet here they were. Now, instead of a clear, predictable system, they had an anomaly. Worse, an anomaly that was still alive. Daniel, still on the ground, barely managed to catch his breath as guards approached him. He expected them to drag him back to his cell, or, worse, finish what the Minotaur had failed to do. Instead, they lifted him to his feet and raised his arm high. The announcer, still recovering from his own laughter, declared the results. Daniel Carter, champion of the arena! More cheers. More disbelief. Daniel barely processed it as he was pulled away from the pit, his legs weak beneath him. His mind screamed at him to wake up, that this had to be some kind of fever dream. But it wasn't. The air was real. The blood on his clothes was real. And somehow, so was his victory. The moment Daniel was thrown into the gladiator barracks, the atmosphere changed. There was no laughter here. The fighters, men and women who had spent years perfecting the art of killing, were silent as they watched him enter. Some stood with their arms crossed, others leaned against weapon racks, sharpening blades that had tasted more blood than Daniel could comprehend. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. This was worse than the arena. These weren't spectators looking for amusement. These were killers trying to make sense of an impossibility. A man stepped forward. Garrick the Butcher. He was infamous even outside the arena, a warrior known for cutting down opponents with ruthless efficiency. His arms were thick with muscle, his face scarred from countless battles. He looked down at Daniel with an expression that was neither admiration nor anger. Just calculation. You, Garrick said, his voice gravelly, are either the luckiest bastard alive, or the most dangerous man in this pit. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. I swear, I have no idea what I'm doing. The fighters exchanged glances. Some scoffed. Others narrowed their eyes. A few whispered. Then why are you still alive? Garrick asked. Daniel had no answer. He had tripped, dodged, and panicked his way through a battle he should have lost. The truth was painfully clear. He shouldn't be here. he wasn't a fighter. He wasn't a warrior. He was just some guy who worked in an office, and now, by some ridiculous twist of fate, he was being regarded as an undefeated champion. The barracks grew tense. It wasn't just disbelief anymore. It was uncertainty. Fighters who had trained for years now stood in front of a man who had won without skill. If it had been anyone else, they would have been challenged on the spot, forced to prove themselves in combat. But no one stepped forward. Garrick exhaled through his nose. "I'm not fighting you." Daniel blinked. "What?" the other warriors murmured. Garrick crossed his arms. "I don't trust anything that wins by accident." One of the others scoffed. "You're scared?" "I'm not an idiot," Garrick muttered. "I've seen enough fights to know when something doesn't add up." He turned his gaze back to Daniel, studying him. "Either you're a fool or you're pretending to be a fool. Either way, I'm not the one who's going to test it." One by one, the others followed suit. Some muttered about curses. Others claimed divine intervention. A few simply shrugged and walked away. Daniel wasn't just an anomaly, he was a problem. By the next morning, the whispers had spread beyond the barracks. Betting houses were in chaos. Who would dare wager against a man who had never lost? But worse, who would bet in his favor when he didn't even know how to win? He was an enigma, an outcome no one could predict, and gambling did not thrive on uncertainty. In the royal palace, the emperor's advisors argued over the situation. Some believed he should be disposed of quietly, lest he continue disrupting the games. Others thought they should make use of him, market him as a mysterious warrior with hidden techniques. The emperor, however, was simply enjoying the chaos. "Let him be," he said, amused. "This is the most fun we've had in years." Daniel, meanwhile, was struggling to adjust to his new reality. Instead of training, he was escorted to feasts, introduced to nobles who were both intrigued and horrified by his existence. The people adored him, not as a warrior, but as a phenomenon. He had become the symbol of absurd victory, a champion without cause. When he tried to explain that he had no idea what was happening, people only found him more fascinating. His insistence on his lack of skill was interpreted as deep humility, or worse, an elaborate strategy to lull future opponents into underestimating him. He sighed as he sat in the training yard, watching actual gladiators practice. A guard leaned against the wall beside him, smirking. "If you keep winning without fighting," the man said, "you might actually get out of here." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Yeah, or I might get killed for real." The guard shrugged. "Luck's been on your side so far." Daniel wasn't sure how much longer that luck would last. The emperor had enjoyed the spectacle at first. The way Daniel had defied all logic and survived his first fight had been nothing short of hilarious. The second, even more so. But now, after weeks of scheduled fights turning into immediate forfeits, his patience was beginning to wear thin. This wasn't what the games were meant to be. The Colosseum of Vandros thrived on carnage, on battle, on warriors testing their mettle against impossible odds. The people wanted blood, not confusion. And yet, every time Daniel was scheduled to fight, the same thing happened. His opponent would take one look at him, think about what had happened to the last challenger, and promptly refuse to engage. At first, the crowd found it amusing. They cheered, chanting, "Daniel the Invincible!" like some divine joke. But amusement only carried so far. Without combat, without the thrill of uncertainty, the excitement of the arena was beginning to wane. The emperor drummed his fingers on the armrest of his throne, watching another failed match unfold. This time, it was supposed to be a battle against a pair of trained assassins from the eastern lands. They had stepped into the arena with confidence, but as soon as Daniel was introduced, they exchanged looks, shook their heads, and walked right back out. The audience booed. Not at Daniel, but at the lack of a fight. "This is getting ridiculous," the emperor muttered. His advisors stood nervously by his side, well aware that the situation had spiraled far beyond their control. One of them, a balding man with an anxious expression, cleared his throat. "Your Grace, perhaps we should stop arranging fights for him." "Stop?" The Emperor raised an eyebrow. Are you suggesting I remove the most famous man in the Empire from the arena? Not remove him, the advisor stammered. Rebrand him. The Emperor sighed. He wasn't interested in rebranding. He wanted his entertainment back. Beyond the palace walls, another crisis was brewing. The underground betting system, which had thrived for generations, was on the verge of collapse. Gambling was built on the illusion of uncertainty, on the idea that anything could happen in the heat of battle. But with Daniel in the picture, there was no uncertainty. There was only an absurd, inexplicable guarantee that no one would fight him. The bookmakers scrambled to make sense of it. Some tried adjusting the odds, offering outrageous payouts to anyone willing to bet against Daniel, but that only made the situation worse. No one was willing to risk their money when the outcome was already determined. I'm telling you, one exasperated bookmaker growled. This guy is cursed. Cursed? Another scoffed. He's just a guy. He's got no skills, no training. Exactly. The first man jabbed a finger at the betting ledger. That's why no one's touching him. Fighters who've been in this business for years won't go near him. You think that's normal? Rumors spread. Some said Daniel was protected by the gods. Others claimed he had sold his soul to some forgotten deity in exchange for eternal survival. A few even believed he was an executioner in disguise, sent by the Emperor to expose and eliminate cowards. As the legend of Daniel the Invincible grew, so did interest from beyond Vandros. Warlords from distant lands, always eager for a new weapon in their endless conflicts, sent messengers with offers of wealth, land, and power if he would fight for them. Daniel, of course, wanted none of it. He sat in his quarters, staring at the newest pile of invitations that had been unceremoniously dumped at his feet. Golden seals, silk-wrapped scrolls, promises of luxury in exchange for his service. It was ridiculous. He wasn't a warrior. He wasn't even particularly athletic. But to the outside world, he had become a living myth, and myths had value. Unbelievable, he muttered. A guard smirked. You should take an offer. You'd probably win without even trying. Daniel groaned, rubbing his temples. That's the problem. I don't even know what I'm winning. The guard chuckled but said nothing more. As the days passed, Daniel became increasingly aware of a single, inescapable truth: this couldn't last forever. He was becoming too famous, too talked about. The Emperor was growing restless. The people were getting impatient. He had stumbled into a system that didn't know what to do with him, and that meant one of two things would happen: either they would let him go, or they would find a way to get rid of him. Neither option seemed likely. He needed to escape. The problem, of course, was that he was too well guarded. No gladiator in their right mind would help him, at least, not publicly. He wasn't a prisoner, exactly, but he wasn't free either. Every move he made was watched. Every interaction was scrutinized. He was, in a way, the Emperor's property. His best chance lay with the few who had begun to see the flaws in the system. The ones who had placed bets on him and lost fortunes. The ones who saw him not as a champion, but as a problem that needed solving. He just had to make them believe that getting him out of Vandros was in their best interest. The hard part would be staying alive long enough to pull it off. The Emperor was done playing games. What had once been an amusing diversion had now turned into a crisis. The people were losing interest. The betting houses were in turmoil. The warriors of the Colosseum refused to fight. And worst of all, Daniel Carter still hadn't died. It had been weeks since his ridiculous first victory, and yet here he was, still walking the halls of the palace as though he belonged there. The Emperor had allowed the joke to run its course, but now it was time for the punchline. Sitting on his golden throne, he leaned forward and addressed his gathered advisors. We need to remind the people why they love the arena. His fingers drummed against the armrest. And we do that by giving them something worth watching. An advisor hesitated. What do you suggest, Your Grace? The Emperor smirked. We pit the invincible fool against something that doesn't care for legends or luck. The next morning, the announcement was made: Daniel Carter would face the dead king. No one expected him to survive. The dead king was not a warrior in the traditional sense. He was not a man of flesh and blood. He was something far older, something whispered about in stories meant to frighten children. A cursed champion, bound by dark magic, resurrected time and time again to serve as the Emperor's ultimate executioner. He did not tire. He did not hesitate. And he had never been defeated. The city buzzed with excitement. This would not be another farce. The betting houses reopened, this time with no confusion. The odds were clear. Daniel would finally lose. Daniel sat in his cell, staring at the wall. "I'm dead." A guard outside his cell exhaled slowly. "Yeah. So," Daniel continued, his voice hollow. "You guys just bring this dead king out whenever someone's too hard to kill?" "Not really. We don't usually need to." Daniel leaned back against the stone wall and closed his eyes. Figures. When they dragged him into the arena, the atmosphere was different. Gone were the cheers, the laughter. The crowd had come not for a spectacle but for an execution. This time, they expected blood. And then, the dead king stepped into the light. He was taller than any man, clad in rusted armor blackened by time and battles fought centuries before. His face was a skull, his eyes nothing but hollow darkness. The moment he moved, the air itself seemed to grow heavier. Daniel gripped his sword, not that it would do anything. He had never been trained to use it properly, and against something like this, it wouldn't have mattered even if he had. The horn sounded. The dead king attacked. There was no delay, no moment of hesitation. The creature moved with the efficiency of something that had done this countless times before. Daniel barely had time to react. He threw himself backward, narrowly avoiding a strike that would have cut him in half. The crowd gasped. The dead king advanced again, relentless. This wasn't like before. There were no lucky slips, no misplaced steps. Every move Daniel made only delayed the inevitable. Pain exploded in his side as the dead king's blade grazed him. He staggered, gripping the wound. Blood dripped onto the sand. The crowd fell silent. For the first time, Daniel Carter had been wounded. The dead king raised his sword for the final blow. And then, he stopped. Daniel, gasping for breath, didn't understand what had happened at first. The blade was inches from his neck, but the strike never landed. Instead, the dead king had gone rigid. Slowly, impossibly, the ancient warrior lowered his weapon. Then, before the entire arena, he dropped to one knee. The silence was deafening. The emperor stood, eyes narrowing. "What is this?" A murmur ran through the crowd. No one had ever seen the dead king hesitate. No one had ever seen him kneel. Daniel, still in shock, took a step back. What?" The dead king's hollow voice echoed through the arena. "The blood of the true ruler runs in his veins." The arena erupted into chaos. The emperor's face darkened. "What did he just say?" Daniel, still gripping his bleeding side, pointed at himself. "Me? You've got the wrong guy." The dead king remained kneeling. "He bears the mark of the old blood. The rightful heir of Vandros." Daniel blinked. He was pretty sure he would have noticed if he had inherited a kingdom. A group of scholars, historians, and palace officials frantically whispered among themselves. One of them, looking pale, hesitantly confirmed what many feared: the dead king only knelt for those of the old royal line, the rulers before the current emperor's dynasty took over. The realization hit the crowd like a hammer. The emperor clenched his jaw. "Kill him!" The order sent the guards scrambling, but it was too late. The crowd had already turned. Chants began, first in scattered voices, then growing into a deafening roar. "Long live the true king!" The gladiators, once spectators, now surged forward. They had spent their lives fighting for the amusement of the emperor, but now they had a cause. A leader. Or, at the very least, a convenient excuse to turn on their captors. Daniel watched, wide-eyed, as the arena dissolved into all-out rebellion. He had no idea how it had come to this. A week ago, he was trying to figure out how to fake an injury to get out of fighting. Now, He was apparently leading a revolution. Great, he muttered, wincing as he touched his wound. Just what I needed. Daniel had never led anything before. He had never given a speech, never commanded an army, never even managed a team project back home without at least one person emailing HR about him forgetting to reply. And yet, here he was, standing in the middle of a battlefield, watching an empire crumble around him, all because a skeleton in rusted armor had pointed at him and said, "That's the guy." The arena was a war zone. Gladiators, once prisoners, had turned on their guards. The audience, split between those loyal to the emperor and those who just wanted to see what would happen next, had started fighting among themselves. The nobility fled the royal stands as the rebellion spilled out of the arena and into the city streets. Daniel had no plan. He barely had a working knowledge of what was happening. His side hurt from where the dead king had nearly sliced him in half, his head was spinning, and the only thing he knew for certain was that the emperor wanted him very, very dead. "Daniel!" Garrick the Butcher, the undefeated champion who had refused to fight him, cut down a guard and turned toward him. "We need to move! The emperor is sending his full army!" Daniel swallowed hard. "Great! So what do we do?" Garrick's expression was unreadable. "We fight." Daniel groaned. "That's the one thing I don't do." Garrick grabbed him by the arm and dragged him through the chaos, shielding him from incoming attacks. "Then start." The rebellion spread faster than anyone had anticipated. It wasn't just the gladiators, former slaves, mistreated soldiers, and even the merchants who had been bled dry by imperial taxes took up arms. What had begun as an arena match was now a full-scale uprising. Daniel, the reluctant figurehead of it all, found himself pulled deeper into a war he wanted no part of. Every time he tried to insist that this was all a mistake, people took it as humility. Every protest was met with more adoration. The more he denied his claim to the throne, the more people believed he was destined for it. The emperor, furious and desperate, gathered what forces he could. His armies were strong, well-trained, and loyal, but even they hesitated. Superstition had wormed its way into their ranks. Soldiers whispered about the dead king's loyalty to Daniel, about the champions who refused to fight him, about how he had won every battle without ever lifting a sword. "What if he can't be killed?" someone murmured in the palace halls. The emperor slammed his goblet onto the table. "He's a fool! A nobody! He is not invincible!" But doubt had already spread. With the city in chaos, Daniel was faced with a choice: either fight a drawn-out war against the emperor's forces or find a way to end it all in a single stroke. "Challenge him," Garrick suggested, his sword resting on his shoulder. Daniel frowned. "Challenge who?" "The emperor," Garrick said. "Single combat. You win, he steps down. You lose." Daniel held up a hand. "No need to finish that sentence." It was a terrible idea. A stupid, reckless, absolutely horrible idea. Which, unfortunately, meant it was the kind of idea that would probably work. The challenge was issued, and the city fell silent. The emperor, furious yet unable to ignore the sheer spectacle of it, accepted. The people gathered in the ruined arena. The same place where Daniel had first been thrown to his supposed death would now be the place where the empire's fate was decided. The emperor stood in gilded armor, his sword gleaming in the sunlight. He was a warrior, not just a ruler, but a man who had fought his way to the throne. He knew battle. He knew how to kill. Daniel, on the other hand, was holding a sword upside down. The moment the fight began, the emperor lunged. Daniel dodged. Not gracefully, not intentionally, but out of sheer panic. He tripped, stumbled, and narrowly avoided getting decapitated. The crowd gasped. The emperor sneered. "You think your luck will last forever?" Daniel did not. The fight was ridiculous. The emperor attacked with precision, with trained, calculated strikes. Daniel, in contrast, moved like a man who was trying to escape a particularly aggressive wasp. He dodged purely by accident, ducked out of reflex, and flailed his sword in ways that no trained fighter ever would. The more it went on, the more unnerved the emperor became. Then, in a moment of pure, unfiltered absurdity, Daniel tripped on his own feet, just as the Emperor swung his sword. The Emperor, expecting resistance, put too much force into the strike. When his blade met nothing but air, he overbalanced. His foot caught on a loose stone. He stumbled. And then, in front of thousands, the most powerful man in Vandros tripped over his own feet and impaled himself on Daniel's poorly held sword. Silence. Daniel, eyes wide, looked down at the dying Emperor, who stared up at him in pure disbelief. "You absolute idiot!" the Emperor gasped before collapsing. The crowd erupted. The war was over. Daniel was declared ruler. And that was the last thing he wanted. Days later, as celebrations swept the city, Daniel sat on the imperial throne, head in his hands. "I don't want to be king," he muttered. "You have to be king," one of the advisors said. "You won the fight." "I tripped," Daniel corrected. Garrick smirked. "And yet here we are," Daniel groaned. "This is a disaster." The truth was, he had no interest in ruling. He had no grand vision for the empire. No plans, no ambitions. He just wanted to go home. And so, in his first and last royal decree, he abdicated. He handed control over to the advisors who actually knew what they were doing and declared himself officially retired. Of course, there was still one problem. He had no idea how to leave Vandros. No one knew how he had arrived in the first place. No one knew how to send him back. So, for now, Daniel Carter, accidental warrior, undefeated champion, and the luckiest idiot in history, was stuck. And as he sat in the sunlit palace gardens, watching the city rebuild, he exhaled slowly. "Well," he muttered, sipping a goblet of wine, "at least I didn't die."